Rick variants and their connections. Season 8 introduces variants that completely demolish every assumption we've made about the Smith family hierarchy and potential. These aren't just new characters, they're proof that the entire Rick and Morty universe operates on principles we never understood. Homesteader Rick destroys the fundamental Rick archetype in ways that should be impossible. This former Citadel cloning scientist, someone who understood genetic manipulation better than almost any Rick, chose farming over science, quiet domesticity over interdimensional chaos. He traded his lab coat for overalls and spent his days growing crops instead of building death machines. But here's the connection that changes everything. When push comes to shove, this Rick sacrifices himself to save Morty clones, not his Morty. Not even real Mortys. Clones he has no personal attachment to whatsoever. This creates a massive problem for every Rick theory we've ever had. If a Rick can develop genuine selfless love for Mortys he doesn't even know, then the entire Ricks use Mortys as camouflage narrative becomes questionable. Evil Morty built his entire revolution around the idea that Ricks inherently exploit Mortys, but Homesteader Rick proves that Rick's cruelty isn't inevitable. It's a choice that can be unmade through different life experiences. The connection to Memory Rick makes this revelation even more disturbing. Memory Rick isn't a real person in any traditional sense. He's Rick's trauma over losing Diane that became so powerful it gained sentience and escaped from Bird Person's mind. Think about the implications here. Rick's emotional pain is so intense, so fundamentally reality-altering, that it can literally create independent life forms that pursue their own goals and agendas. This connects directly to Rick Prime's devastating impact on our main Rick's psychological development. If Memory Rick represents Rick's trauma made manifest, then every cruel thing our Rick has done, every cold calculation and heartless decision, traces back to Rick Prime's original sin of murdering Diane and Beth. Season 8 is showing us that Rick's psychological damage has become a force of nature that affects reality itself across multiple dimensions. Boss Hog Rick reveals the most terrifying connection of all, the cyclical nature of Rick's toxic behavior. Even after the Citadel falls, even after Evil Morty's revolution supposedly liberates Mortys from Rick oppression, some Ricks will automatically rebuild the exact same toxic power structures. This Rick clone is actively kidnapping Morty clones for experiments, proving that Rick's compulsive need to dominate and exploit Mortys isn't learned behavior from bad experiences. It's hardwired into their existence across infinite realities, suggesting the Rick-Morty dynamic represents something fundamental about how these beings relate to each other on a cosmic level. Morty evolution breaking the victim cycle. Arcade Morty and Doc Morty represent the most dangerous development in Season 8, proof that Mortys don't need to become evil to become powerful. These variants completely shatter the binary choice we thought Mortys faced: remain weak victims or become evil Morty-level manipulators. Arcade Morty operates as a confident leader and tactical thinker who runs both an arcade and the town's general store. When crisis hits his community, he doesn't panic, stutter, or look around desperately for a Rick to save him. Instead, he steps up and protects his fellow Mortys through genuine heroic leadership. This isn't the cold, calculating manipulation that Evil Morty uses. This is authentic courage and competence. The connection to Doc Morty makes this even more significant. Doc Morty works alongside Arcade Morty as an equal partner, not a subordinate or rival. Think about what this means for Morty development. These variants prove that competent Mortys can form collaborative relationships rather than the hierarchical power structures that define Rick-Morty dynamics. They've created something that shouldn't exist in the Rick and Morty universe: functional teamwork between equals. This destroys Evil Morty's fundamental premise. Evil Morty argued that the only way for a Morty to escape Rick's exploitation was through superior intelligence and ruthless manipulation. But Arcade Morty and Doc Morty show there are other paths for Morty evolution that don't require becoming a sociopathic genius. They've achieved independence and competence while maintaining their essential decency and compassion. The most disturbing implication is what this reveals about our main Morty's stunted development. If these Morty clones can become confident leaders and skilled professionals, then our Morty's continued weakness isn't because he lacks potential. It's because Rick actively suppresses that potential. Every time Rick dismisses Morty's ideas, every casual insult and humiliation, every dangerous adventure that leaves Morty traumatized, these aren't just personality quirks, they're systematic destruction of Morty's natural growth. Season 8 suggests that Rick doesn't just use Mortys as camouflage, he actively prevents them from reaching their full potential because competent Mortys would be threats to Rick's control. Arcade Morty and Doc Morty exist because they developed without Rick's toxic influence, proving that the Rick-Morty relationship isn't symbiotic, it's parasitic. Rick needs weak Mortys, but Mortys don't need Rick at all. This connects back to the Citadel's warning about summers becoming too dangerous when included in adventures. The pattern is clear. Smith family members have incredible potential that's systematically suppressed by Rick's presence. These Season 8 variants aren't accidents. They're glimpses of what everyone could become if Rick wasn't actively sabotaging their development. Jerry variants escaping the failure paradigm. Mooch Jerry and Boss Jerry represent the most shocking revelation in Season 8. Proof that Jerry's pathetic existence isn't an inherent flaw, but a circumstantial trap that can be escaped through radical life choices. Mooch Jerry shatters everything we thought we knew about Jerry Smith's fundamental nature. This vagabond Jerry travels the multiverse independently, having escaped every single thing that makes regular Jerry pathetic: family obligations, social expectations, the desperate need for approval from people who don't respect him. He's not trying to prove himself to anyone because he's built an identity that doesn't require external validation. The connection to Boss Jerry makes this even more significant. Boss Jerry leads a group of rogue Jerrys who travel the road, an interdimensional highway system. But here's the twisted part. He's built his entire identity around being the Jerry who escaped, and he sees other Jerry's independence attempts as direct threats to his unique status. This creates a horrifying paradox where the Jerry who escaped Jerryness becomes possessive and territorial about his escape route. This reveals the deepest truth about Jerry variants. They're not just escaping their circumstances, they're escaping the fundamental Jerry identity itself. Regular Jerry fails because he's trapped in a role that demands he be the family failure, the comic relief, the punching bag that makes everyone else feel superior. But these variants prove that Jerry's problems aren't genetic or psychological. They're systemic. Think about what this means for our main Jerry's relationship with the Smith family. Every time Beth rolls her eyes at him, every time Rick dismisses him as worthless, every time his own children treat him like an embarrassment, these aren't natural responses to Jerry's inherent inadequacy. They're learned behaviors that maintain a family dynamic where Jerry serves as the designated failure so everyone else can feel competent by comparison. Mooch Jerry and Boss Jerry achieved something that should be impossible. They broke free from the Jerry role entirely. They're not trying to be better Jerrys or prove they deserve respect within the family structure. They abandoned the whole system and built new identities from scratch in environments where nobody expects them to be failures. The most disturbing implication is what this reveals about family dynamics across the multiverse. If Jerry can become competent and independent simply by removing himself from situations that require him to be pathetic, then the Smith family isn't a support system. It's a prison where each member is trapped in a role that prevents their growth. These Jerry variants didn't just escape bad circumstances, they escaped a family system that needed them to stay weak and dependent to function properly. Beth's trauma revelation through de-aging. Beth and Space Beth's de-aging adventure in the Curixus case of Benjamin Button reveals the most heartbreaking connection in Season 8. Proof that their seemingly opposite life paths are actually identical coping mechanisms for the same fundamental abandonment wound. When both Beths literally become children again, they're forced to confront their shared childhood trauma without the adult defense mechanisms they've spent decades perfecting. Regular Beth chose suburban stability and Space Beth chose galactic adventure. But Season 8 reveals these aren't different personalities. They're different strategies for dealing with Rick's abandonment that happened to both versions in childhood. The connection becomes devastating when you realize that Space Beth's rebellion and regular Beth's compliance are functionally identical responses to the same psychological damage. Space Beth fights the Galactic Federation and becomes a wanted criminal, rejecting all authority figures as a way to reject Rick's control over her life. Regular Beth seeks Rick's approval and builds a conventional family, trying to prove she's worthy of the love Rick withheld when she was young. But here's the twist that changes everything. Neither strategy actually works. Space Beth still resents Rick just as intensely as regular Beth does, maybe more, because all her accomplishments feel hollow without his acknowledgement. Regular Beth still feels inadequate despite building the stable family life she thought would make her happy. Both versions are still that abandoned little girl trying to understand why Daddy left. The de-aging episode forces them to experience their childhood trauma simultaneously, revealing that the split between them isn't about different choices. It's about different survival strategies developed by the same wounded psyche. Space Beth represents Beth's anger and defiance, while regular Beth represents her people-pleasing and accommodation. Neither version is complete because they're both fragments of what Beth could have been if Rick hadn't broken her during her formative years. This connects to every other Smith family variant we've seen. Just like Jerry's variants escape the failure role and Morty's variants escape the victim role, Beth's variants are attempts to escape the abandoned daughter role. But unlike the other family members, Beth's split shows that sometimes escape isn't possible. Sometimes the trauma is so fundamental that it creates multiple versions of the same person, each carrying different pieces of the original wound. Season 8 suggests that Space Beth and regular Beth working together represents psychological integration. The possibility that Beth can reclaim all the parts of herself that Rick's abandonment fragmented. Their mutual respect and cooperation isn't just character development, it's healing from decades of psychological damage that created the split in the first place. Summer's organic evolution versus variant creation. Summer's evolution in Season 8 represents something unprecedented in the Rick and Morty universe. Natural character growth that doesn't require dimensional variants or traumatic breaks from family systems. After 17 years in a simulation, Summer becomes more confident and intelligent, but this isn't an alternative version discovery. It's organic development of abilities that were always present. This destroys the variant pattern we see with every other Smith family member. Rick needs variants like Homesteader Rick to show his potential for good. Morty needs variants like Arcade Morty to demonstrate competence. Jerry needs variants like Mooch Jerry to prove he can escape failure. Beth needs Space Beth to express her suppressed ambitions. But Summer doesn't need variants because she's already becoming the best possible version of herself within the main timeline. The connection to Night Summer makes this even more significant. Night Summer controls her Rick through what appears to be natural relationship dynamics rather than the elaborate schemes Evil Morty required. This suggests Summer's path to power doesn't involve breaking the system or escaping it. She's learning to master it from within while maintaining her essential personality and moral compass. Season 8 reveals why Summer's development follows a different pattern than her family members. While Rick suppresses Morty's growth, dismisses Jerry's potential, and abandoned Beth during her formative years, he's never systematically undermined Summer. She entered his world as a teenager with an already formed identity, making her resistant to the psychological manipulation that stunted everyone else's development. The Citadel Rick's warning that Summer's become too dangerous when included in adventures now makes perfect sense. Unlike other Smith family members who need to escape their assigned roles, Summer can grow within the existing family structure because she was never given a limiting role to begin with. She's the wild card who entered the Rick and Morty dynamic from the outside and began changing it through sheer force of personality. This connects to Summer's consistent role as the family's voice of reason and crisis manager throughout the series. While other family members either rebel against Rick or enable his worst behaviors, Summer treats him like a problematic family member who needs management rather than worship or revolution. She's naturally evolved into the position that everyone else needs variants to achieve: functional independence while maintaining family connections. The most shocking implication is that Summer might represent what healthy development looks like in the Rick and Morty universe. While everyone else requires dramatic breaks from their established patterns, Summer shows that growth can happen gradually through experience and maturity. She's proof that not every Smith family member needs to choose between weakness and villainy. Sometimes competence and goodness can coexist and strengthen each other over time. Confirmed to proceed with the next section? The Complete Theory Destruction. Season 8's variants don't just introduce new characters, they systematically destroy every foundational theory about how the Rick and Morty universe operates, revealing that everything we thought we understood about family dynamics, power structures, and character potential was fundamentally wrong. The Rick hierarchy theory collapses completely when you connect Homesteader Rick's sacrifice to Memory Rick's existence. If Rick's cruelty stems from trauma rather than inherent nature, and that trauma can literally escape containment to become independent entities, then Rick isn't the universe's apex predator, he's its most damaged victim. Rick Prime didn't just murder our Rick's family, he created a psychological wound so severe it warps reality across multiple dimensions. Evil Morty's revolution becomes tragically incomplete in light of Arcade Morty and Doc Morty's existence. Evil Morty argued that Mortys could only escape exploitation through superior intelligence and ruthless manipulation, but Season 8 proves there are paths to Morty empowerment that don't require becoming a sociopathic genius. This means Evil Morty's solution, destroying the central finite curve, was overkill for a problem that had simpler solutions. The Jerry failure paradigm disintegrates when you realize that Mooch Jerry and Boss Jerry didn't become competent through character development. They became competent by abandoning the Jerry identity entirely. This reveals that Jerry's pathetic existence isn't a personality flaw, but a systemic role that the Smith family needs him to fill. Regular Jerry fails because the family dynamic requires a designated failure to maintain everyone else's sense of superiority. Beth's abandonment issues take on cosmic significance when connected to Space Beth's parallel development. Their de-aging adventure proves that Rick's psychological damage doesn't just affect him, it fragments his family members into multiple, incomplete versions of themselves. Beth isn't just dealing with daddy issues. She's dealing with dimensional splitting caused by trauma so severe it creates alternative timelines. Summer's natural evolution exposes the most devastating truth of all. Every other Smith family member's stunted development is artificially maintained. If Summer can become confident and capable through normal growth, then Rick, Morty, Jerry, and Beth's various limitations aren't inherent traits, but actively maintained psychological prisons. The central finite curve itself becomes questionable when you realize that Rick's supposed superiority depends on systematically suppressing everyone else's potential. Rick isn't the smartest being in the universe, he's the being who's best at preventing others from reaching their full capabilities. The curve doesn't contain realities where Rick is the smartest. It contains realities where Rick can maintain the illusion of being the smartest. Season 8 reveals that the entire Rick and Morty universe operates on a lie, that some people are inherently superior and others are inherently inferior. Every variant proves that potential is universal, but circumstances and psychological manipulation determine whether that potential gets realized or suppressed. The real horror isn't interdimensional monsters or cosmic threats. It's families that systematically prevent their own members from becoming who they could be.